Hi guys, I wanted to go through our slideshow that we went through part of today and didn't finish, and so I'm going to do this from the current slide, basically, meaning from the very beginning of our brain atlas thing. I figured that might make more sense in the long run, so I'm going to just move some things around here just for a moment. Alright, we're back. So, what I wanted to do is basically start off with this slide. These are the things that we need to know. 25 different issues that we want to try to be able to identify. And I have sort of specified some of the different areas of the lateral ventricle defined and so forth, and tried to kind of clarify what you need to be able to pull out of these different pictures. The pictures that you'll get on the exam will be in grayscale pictures, so they won't be in color. But we work hard to make sure that the contrast is really clear, and we haven't had any issues with that. But just so you know, our first slide in here, number 1, is showing a coronal section of the anterior most part of the sections that we'll look at. So we're progressing from the front and moving back. And the very front, what we're sectioning through is the frontal lobe. And what we have are a couple of different features here. We have our corpus callosum that's present here, and it's going in and it's actually helping to connect through the commissural fibers between the two hemispheres. We also have the head of the caudate nucleus present here as part of the lateral ventricles, or as making up the lateral wall of the lateral ventricles. And then, of course, we have also the anterior horn of the lateral ventricles. So in class, I said that you don't have to be that specific for the lateral ventricles, that you could put lateral ventricle there, and that's one case that you can do it. It's good to remember that it's the anterior horn because that will help you be able to integrate it with some of the other information that you have elsewhere. Other areas I'm going to ask you to be more specific, and I'll get to those in just a moment. So in slide number 2, what we've done is that we've moved back a little bit, and the caudate nucleus has expanded. It's gotten a little bit larger here. And you can also see some fragmentation that's occurred along these different areas here. This is where we have bands of white matter that are going through that make up the anterior limb of our internal capsule. In class, I referred to a previous slide. We can actually just go back to that slide. Why not? And I can show you where that anterior capsule is. Remember here where we were actually showing how the thalamus has projections that move out and move into the anterior capsule, through the anterior limb of the internal capsule? That's where we're seeing, and that's where we're sectioning through right now. So in fact, this is really useful because we went through and we did one section like here, where we saw just a little bit of the caudate nucleus. That was our slide number 1. And now as we've moved back further, we can see it more clearly. We can see some of these other domains, the lateral ventricles in the middle, and the caudate nucleus, and this anterior limb that we can see more clearly. Let's go back to our slides. Okay, so as we continue to move further back, we have our anterior horn of the lateral ventricle present here, the head of our caudate nucleus, so we do want to be specific about that, and also the putamen that's located more laterally. So we have two different components that we're seeing emerge here. So you do want to remember, what is it that actually goes through that limb of the internal capsule? The anterior limb of the internal capsule carries those fibers that help to connect the prefrontal cortex, for example, to the thalamus. And is important for being able to help connectivity and for attention as one of the primary roles that it's important in. Moving on to slide number 3, what we can see here is we again have our anterior horn of the lateral ventricle again, our head of the caudate nucleus. We've moved back a little bit further and we can see the putamen emerging here. So it's a structure that's located a little further back in the brain. We have the septum pellucidum that helps separate the two different lateral ventricles from each other. And we have the corpus callosum up here. We also can see down here the temporal lobe. We'll see this temporal lobe emerge further and more as we move back. But right now we're just kind of nicking it, as you can see right there. Fine. So as we look at this, let's go back a little bit further and see, and as we've moved back, we're at the level of the nucleus accumbens. We've moved, and we can see the presence of how it's kind of fused together, the two different structures here. Some of this is contiguous with each other. So we have our caudate nucleus here, we have our nucleus accumbens here, and then we have our putamen over here. Caudate has been labeled on this side, the putamen has been labeled on this side. You will want to be able to identify them on either side. The leader lines won't necessarily always point to the same side. So I could ask for the caudate nucleus on this side or ask for the caudate nucleus on this side. Okay, great. We talked about the nucleus accumbens, and I gave you an aside that's important for reward, and that's nice. It's not something you have to remember. But the corpus callosum is also the structure that's being shown here, that band of white that's helping to carry some of those commissural fibers. So speaking of commissural fibers, as we move further back, what we can see is the presence and the appearance of our anterior commissure here, which helps to connect the two temporal lobes together and coordinate the movement of information between those two different lobes. What we can also see is that we still have our caudate making up the lateral wall, the lateral ventricle, that's present here and also present here. So you're going to want to remember that that's what we see, even in this particular section. We have our corpus callosum that's present right here, so we want to make sure that we can recognize that. And then we also can see, and what's being identified in this area is our coronal radii. So those are these are the fibers that emerge from the internal capsule and spread out and into and start to connect to different areas of the cortex. And so we're identifying this sort of patch of white matter as being that coronal radii. The other thing that we also can see here is the presence of our internal capsule. We see it on this side, and then we also see it on this side. The nucleus accumbens is no longer visible, so we're only seeing the anterior commissure here, and the globus pallidus is present right here, and then we have our putamen present right here. All right. What we can see also, and what we're identifying here, is the substantia innominati is present right here, and that's just I just want you to remember just where that particular component is. Moving back then into slide number 6, what are we looking at is the moving part right here is the hippocampus. We're seeing how it's indicating the seahorse, which is hinting at the sort of shape that we have down here of this temporal lobe structure known as the hippocampus. Also present in the temporal lobe, it's hard to see it on this side, but clear on this side, we can see the amygdala. The amygdala is bilateral, but probably the section is off a little bit or tilted so that we can see the structure more apparent here. So this is within the temporal lobe. So we've cut through the brain here, and it's in this area of the temporal lobe that we see the amygdala present. It's smoother. It doesn't have the same kinds of appearance of white matter that we see here in the hippocampus, where we see some striations in there. And then what we also have is that we have the globus pallidus, and here we've actually identified the lateral segment and the medial segment as two different parts of the globus pallidus. What we also can see is the caudate still present here, very small, but still making that lateral wall of the lateral ventricle. And then the body of the lateral ventricle as well. So now that we've gone past the anterior commissure, we're seeing that body of the lateral ventricle, and we're positioned right up in there. And we have our thalamus that's present. The most medial structures are making up our thalamus, and these include some important different nuclei, that some of which we'll point out in a little bit. So we moving backwards. And the mammillary bodies. These are located. These two structures here are located along the midline. Damage to them, interestingly, is something that can happen with chronic alcoholism. You can see damage there and see a type of memory disorder known as Korsakoff syndrome, usually related to B vitamin deficiency. But there's and so that's an interesting an aside that it's just for fun. But we do want to remember where those structures are. Moving back a little bit further, again, what we can see is this little patch right here. If you're curious, that is the caudate nucleus here and here, still stretching backwards. The body of the lateral ventricle is here. We can see our globus pallidus here. We're not defining whether it's the internal or the medial or lateral segment of the globus pallidus. because it's too hard to really be able to discriminate that very easily. But the thalamus is located in this area, so we have on this side and also on this side. So what's new here? What we can see is that we have our internal capsule present, and this is the posterior limb of the internal capsule here and also here. So before I mentioned that we had the anterior limb of the internal capsule, and I pointed out where that was. I want to just point out where the posterior limb of the internal capsule is, so you can sort of get an idea of where we are and how it starts to project backwards, and then also where the genu of the internal capsule is. So let's go back to that slide. Okay. So the genu is at this bend right in here of the internal capsule, and then you can see how the posterior limb starts to emerge and move backwards right along in here. So these are some of the different areas that we have for that internal capsule, and we actually have it well labeled as one of the last slides that you have to review. So let's keep going. Fine. So now we've identified this posterior limb of the internal capsule. What else are we seeing here? This is the substantia nigra. These darkly stained nuclei here are the ones that are targeted for destruction in Parkinson's disease. I only want you to be able to tell me what the structure is, but as an aside, that is an interesting pathology that's related to it. This structure is located within the midbrain. So what's happened is that as we've sectioned through here, the midbrain that's tucked in right around in here, we're starting to see some of it apparent in this particular section here. So here's our thalamus, there's our midbrain, and then above the thalamus here we see our cortex and these different structures. The tail of the caudate nucleus is appearing down here, and so if you can remember from when we learned about the ventricles, one of the things that we saw with the caudate nucleus was that it actually curled around and has a tail to it as well. And so this is where we actually have the tail of the caudate nucleus. You can see it here. And actually you can see a little bit of it right over there. The hippocampus, again, makes an appearance and is present there. We also have our subthalamic nucleus that's located below the thalamus. Well, All right. So our next thing that we have is our the body of the lateral ventricle still present here. There's our caudate nucleus still present there. We're a little bit further back, and this is where we can start to see how the internal capsule has started to form these bands of and kind of focus bands that proceed down to either the bulbar structures or down into the spinal cord. And so we're seeing how they kind of move down that way. The substantia nigra is still prominent here. We can see the reticular part of the internal capsule projecting out here. That's part of that posterior part of the posterior limb. The longitudinal fissure, which we haven't identified in some of those other pictures, but is present right along here, separating the two different hemispheres, is present. Our hippocampus is still present there. Our red nucleus is present here. We saw that in one of the earlier slides where we were looking at diagrams of the picture, or diagrams of the midbrain. So the red nucleus is again part of that midbrain. And we can also see that we have the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. It's kind of hard to see there. It's small, but there it is. And so that helps to kind of define some of these structures we have located more posteriorly. As we move further back, what we can see, again, the body of the lateral ventricle is our sort of guide here. We can see the presence of that caudate still. Here's the thalamus. I'm not going to ask you to remember that it's the habenula, just that it's the thalamus we see here. The retrolenticular part of the internal capsule is present right along in there. We have the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle still present. The thalamus is actually the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. If you remember, that carries visual information. I do want you to remember that name, the lateral geniculate nucleus, and be able to identify it here and here. The lateral geniculate nucleus helps to form some of that retrolenticular part of the internal capsule that's so important for vision. As we move further back, we're starting to see the more posterior structures of the brain. The thalamus, again, is present here. I'm not going to ask you to remember that it's the pulvinar nucleus, just that it's the thalamus. We also have the hippocampus. It's still present. It's a long structure. The inferior horn of the lateral ventricle we can also identify. The cerebral aqueduct, which helps to form that, it helps to carry some of the CSF from that third and fourth ventricle out into the spinal cord and some of the other regions here. We can see it present right here. The pineal gland, thought by some philosophers to be the seat of the soul, is located right here. And of course, the body of the lateral ventricle again. So, in horizontal sections, I have one slide that I want you to try to do, but there's a lot on it. So let's take a look at what we have here. What we want to be able to appreciate in this horizontal section is the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles here, and how they're present in this sort of lens shape here. The head of the caudate nucleus is present right there. The putamen is located on the other side of a white band. So this white band is actually the anterior limb of our internal capsule. If you remember, it's what helps to separate the two regions. So here we are, anterior limb of the internal capsule again. And the putamen resides here, and the globus pallidus is located a little bit more medially. So when we took sections through here and looked at it, we saw that that anterior limb of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. We saw the caudate nucleus making the lateral wall of it, and then we also saw the presence of the putamen and located on the other side of this white band. So you can go back and forth between those slides to try to help make that connection. The genu of the internal capsule is being pointed out here. The posterior limb of the internal capsule is being demonstrated right here. The retrolenticular part of the internal capsule here. And we're not seeing the sublenticular part of it because that actually proceeds down out of the plane of this page. So unfortunately, we won't be able to identify that one. We have also the thalamus is being demonstrated right in here and in here. And if you remember, as we were sectioning through, we saw a lot of the thalamus. We saw the pulvinar part of it and other regions of the thalamus. And so that's what was going on as we were moving backwards. Finally, we also have the splenium of the corpus callosum. And so if you remember, there's two different areas of this corpus callosum, the rostrum up here and the splenium of the corpus callosum. And these two different domains help to carry information. And so at the time we went through the corpus callosum, I was mentioning, oh yeah, there's some really interesting kind of components about this. We have a bunch of fibers from carrying from the anterior part of the frontal lobe that's helping to connect the rostrum of the corpus callosum. And so it kind of, the fibers have to come back and then be able to cross over. So lesions here can have a profound effect on function throughout this lobe here. Again, also in the splenium, we see a similar type of theme where the corpus callosum helps to connect the two different hemispheres. And we have this sort of forceps-like area here where a lot of the different fibers are bundling together to cross over to the other side. Those are our main, those are the slides that we have for our human atlas. This is just for some clarification, but I'm not going to give you a picture like this, but it could help to be able to, when you go back and look at a picture like this. All right, that's it. Good luck.